You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with exerciseprescriber.com, and this is session 63. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm still Jack Chew, and first and foremost, thank you so much to those of you that pledged on Kickstarter. We absolutely smashed our target, and therefore we will be bringing you more as planned from season 2 of Physio Matters, deep dives into clinical topics, and it really supports the work we're doing and helps me to keep the team together. They're all sought after individuals that essentially need at least their expenses covering now. They've volunteered for long enough, and so for us to be able to offer expenses and help bring guests to the studio, for example, is a massive help. So thank you so much for that. Also unlocks our potential to do patient matters and health matters, so patient narratives, finding out their stories and experiences in healthcare, and then also with health matters we'll be able to touch some of the adjacent but relevant topics that touch MSK practice and other parts of therapy disciplines, so be that nutrition, sleep, exercise as a general public health concern, and health policy and how we might enact some of the changes that are suggested by our brilliant guests across the podcast. So thanks so much to those supporting that, as well as those on Patreon that continue to support us on a monthly basis. Please do visit that if you feel you can give us a few pounds. Huge thanks once again to exerciseprescriber.com, who are sponsoring this episode, and continuing to be pleased to work with them. Really is a great product and one that we use on a regular basis. Here at HQ, up in Manchester, we've integrated that into our work, and the patients absolutely love it. One of the best interfaces we've used, and trust us, we've been through them. You can imagine how many times we get courted by companies that are peddling all sorts of stuff, whereas these guys are the real deal, and they really will make sure that it integrates into your work and into your practice in a really nice, seamless manner. So do get in touch with exerciseprescriber.com, as they will always be absolutely upfront about what they can do to help you and your clinic. I'm delighted to announce, if you haven't spotted it already on social media, that the Big R's Conference 2.0, Reforming MSK Practice 2019, is going to happen 18th and 19th of October in Manchester. Ticket options are soon going to be available, reform.physio/conference, or you'll be able to follow links to our Ticket Tailor website very shortly, but do save the date. And as you'll have noticed, hashtag the Big R's, reasoning, responsibility and reform is the hashtag that is changing the conversation around MSK practice, and you can be involved in it. We're going to go bigger, we're going to go better, and you need to save the date and pay attention to ticket options as they come out very shortly. Here's another episode that I'm not on, so it's a 2 on the bounce. I'm not the interviewer, but Felicity went to another Pain Cloud conference, as she describes in a second. This time was exposed to the brilliance of Neil O'Connell, and who is discussing research biases and how we interpret and understand evidence, and how we can better help the communities we want to serve by better incorporating and improving the conversation and enriching the dialogue between clinicians and researchers. So this is a brilliant conversation. Really think you're going to enjoy it, and well done to Felicity for getting it together. Thank you so much to Neil for coming on the show. Big fan of his work, and he's been supportive of the podcast over the years, so we do thank him for that. So it's absolutely brilliant to get him on, although it's taken 63 episodes for us to do so, but his name's been mentioned pretty much every year since we've been doing it, so it's just fantastic to get him on the show, and I know you're going to enjoy it. So without further ado, I'll bring you Felicity Thow and Neil O'Connell, and I'll see you at the other side.
Hello and welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast with me, Felicity Thow, back behind the mic. It's a deja vu story today, whereby I went to another Pain Cloud conference, learnt some really cool stuff, and thought that this would make a really good podcast. And so here we are today, and I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Neil O'Connell, a senior lecturer at Brunel University, researcher and a member of the NICE Guideline Development Group and Specialist Committee, to talk about research and evidence-based practice in physio. Neil, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on. And You're welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit further?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a senior lecturer at Brunel. I'm a physio by background, an MSK physio, but to my shame, at the moment I don't practice. I just work. Part of my time is spent training undergrads and postgrad physios, and the other part of my time is spent on research. My research is largely around evidence of effectiveness in pain, and in that role I'm a member of the Cochrane Pain Palliative and Supportive Care Group, I'm an editor there. And with regards to my involvement with NICE, I was on the guideline development group for the 2016 guideline for low back pain and sciatica.
Brilliant, brilliant. If this sounds all right with you, Neil, I think this podcast will probably take two strands. One being how we can improve our basic literacy skills in consuming the evidence, and the other being a bit of an insight into how the NICE guidelines are put together and some of the challenges that evidence-based practice presents to clinicians and healthcare more globally.
Sure.
Fab. So you're a lecturer, as you say, in the undergrad research methods module for physio students at Brunel. And for some of our listeners, their own research module won't have been that long ago, but for others, myself included, it's been a while. So I hope we could go through a bit of a crash course refresher on how we can be better consumers of the literature. So first up, when we think about physio research, we're often wondering if a treatment is or isn't effective. But what does it mean when research says a treatment is effective? And can you talk to us a bit about effect sizes and hidden responders too?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves the question first, what do we mean by effectiveness? And normally in the clinic, we mean, all good things. We mean substantial reduction in symptoms or recovery, restoration of function, improvement in quality of life, and can be any of those things. For the purposes of research, we need to define exactly what we mean. Because we need to set a primary outcome there. Now, one of the problems with observing outcomes in the clinic is that ultimately you won't know whether your improvement in symptoms genuinely represents effectiveness or simply a good outcome. And there are lots of reasons for a good outcome. And I don't want to teach people things they already know, but we all know that for many conditions, symptoms are expected to improve essentially regardless of what you do. Natural history plays a role, and there are all sorts of non-specific effects associated with that theatre of having a clinical experience and a clinical interaction. So in order to test more robustly, of course, we need controlled clinical trials, and the best type of controlled clinical trial is an RCT. And I think something Steve Camper, the researcher from University of Sydney, he once framed it the best way for me, and that is you can't measure effectiveness unless you're comparing it to something else. The only way you can measure effectiveness is in comparison with an alternative. And that alternative might be a placebo, or it might be no treatment, or it might be usual care. So what effectiveness really means for us if we conduct a rigorous RCT and we control for all those biases that it's possible to control for, is that after treatment, compared to whatever we've chosen to compare it to, is there a difference between the two groups on our outcome that we've chosen beforehand? And is that difference reliable enough that we can say, yes, it's likely not just to be a function of chance alone? And then, and this is the bit that often gets lost, is it big enough to actually be meaningful to the patients that we're trying to make decisions about?
And who is it? Do you think researchers are good enough at deciding that of is that effectiveness? Is that what you'd mean by clinical significance?
Okay. Well, clinical importance is a bit of a vexed question because it's a very hard thing to establish. So we've got all sorts of consensus statements and guidance in the world of persistent pain, for instance. So if we think about what would represent a clinically important improvement in pain, and an international consensus group, the IMPACT group, came up with a 50% improvement in pain would represent a substantial improvement in pain. A 30% improvement in pain or more is a moderately important change. Anything above sort of 10 to 15% would be minimally important, and anything less than that is likely to be trivial. But the problem with that is it's a generic rule. Now, it was benchmarked against other measures. So they benchmarked that in various groups of people with persistent pain against their sort of global perceived effect score. So there is a marker for it. But it's still rather arbitrary, because actually how much pain improvement you would want to see is probably very specific. It's specific on, well, how bad your pain is at the start. It's probably dependent on the intervention that you're having, how inconvenient is it? What are the costs? What are the risks? How keen are you on having that? It's probably quite specific to the population that you're trying to make decisions about. And if we're honest, it's probably quite specific to the individual patient that you're trying to make decisions about. And the other thing about looking at change within a patient is that actually that isn't a measure of treatment effect, as we've already said. That's a measure of outcome, of which a specific treatment effect might just be one contributor. So then what we're trying to think of is, well, how much change on average between our treatment and a control group would be enough to be clinically important. And that's much more abstract a concept, and it's proven much harder to come up with a consensus. The OMERAC 12 group recently suggested that a reasonable minimal important difference for a between group difference, which of course is a measure of treatment effect, would be a 1-point change on a 0 to 10 pain scale, or a 10 millimeter change on a 0 to 100 visual analog scale, which of course I think most of us would think appears to be pretty small, and does beg the question, how low can you go? But it's worth looking at that because, I mean, if you take the NICE guidance for back pain as an example, we employed a 1-point change on a 0 to 10 pain scale as our threshold for minimal clinically importance for between group effect sizes. And it had a substantial impact on the number of treatments that appeared to be effective based on the available evidence. And actually, when you look across treatments for persistent pain, many treatments fall below that 1-point threshold on the 0 to 10 pain scale for a between group difference. So clearly, it appears to be low, but our treatments aren't awfully good at crossing that rather low bar. Of course, then that leads people to start thinking, well, maybe that's too high a bar. My argument with that would be, well, maybe it only appears to be high because we're not awfully good at jumping it.
Sure. Yeah, no, it does seem low, doesn't it? 1 point on that scale.
It does.
It does. And so that's interesting. That's what NICE use as their standard of
that's
what
to recommend.
Used
in that guideline, but it isn't necessarily what would be used in other guidelines. That's just a decision that was made by the guideline group for that guideline.
Fair enough. And you mentioned, I think you talked in your talk at Pain Cloud about effect sizes and hidden responders as well. Can you give us any guidance on that?
Well, we were talking about that the average difference between two groups after an intervention being our best measure of the effectiveness of a treatment. But of course, it's a very abstract thing because who does it apply to? Who is average in our trials? And so there are some arguments against that as our best measure of outcome. Andrew Moore, who's at our Cochrane group, he has looked at pharmacological agents and shown that outcomes are often not normally distributed, that actually there's normally a bimodal distribution. And what we mean by that is that a substantial proportion of people who receive the drug might have a very big response, 50% improvement or more. Very few people have a small response, and then another reasonable size group have no response at all. And one interpretation of that is essentially that there is a subgroup of responders who do very well with that treatment and a subgroup of non-responders. And so that when we average across that, we see small or reasonably mediocre effects because the responders are being washed out by the non-responders. And so one proposed solution to that is, rather than to measure the between group difference on average on your continuous 0 to 10 pain scale, is to rather count the number of people who achieve what we would consider to be a clinically important treatment outcome. So maybe a 50% improvement in pain, and then just compare the proportion statistically who achieved that threshold in the treatment group versus the control group. But there's a problem with that too, insofar that we call that a responder analysis, and you're essentially counting responders in each group, but really you're not. That's a misnomer. What you're counting is outcomes, good outcomes. And those good outcomes may reflect a treatment response, but they may just reflect a good outcome because of natural history or some other reason. And so people tend to interpret them like they're counting responders, but they're not. So, I mean, you could petition for it to be called a probability of a good outcome analysis, but that's not quite as catchy.
Yeah.
And the other problem is it doesn't necessarily mean that the treatment has delivered a large response in those patients.
Yeah.
Because it might well be that the normal trajectory was a reasonably substantial improvement, but actually a very small effect has just tipped them over our arbitrary threshold for response. It might be that the patient's symptoms would without the treatment have worsened, and having the treatment has led to a clinically important reduction in that worsening, but they would be considered a non-responder because their symptoms hadn't improved. So the problem with responder analysis is that it's kind of imprecise, and it dichotomizes quite a sensitive scale into a very much a yes or no answer, but it may misclassify some people as responders and some people as non-responders. And it's perfectly possible that, in truth, a small treatment effect could be enough to tip enough people over that threshold that you end up looking like you have a very favourable responder analysis, when in fact the treatment is only actually delivering a trivial difference. My view on it is that the mean between group difference is still a very useful measure and very sensitive. Responder analyses are another interesting way to look at the data, but the idea that they are somehow fixing the problems of the between group difference is incorrect. I think they give us another way to look at the data that carries its own limitations and problems.
No, fair enough. That's brilliant. And we talk about p-values as well. I think that's one of the things where I'll call myself a novice reading the literature. P-values, you go, brilliant, that's significant. But I remember we talked about what p-values don't tell us, and I wondered if you could talk to us about what p-values maybe don't share.
Yeah, I mean, I have the luxury of teaching research methods to undergrads and postgrads, and I think if we're all honest, we know it's the unwanted stepchild of modules on most clinical programs. No one came to learn what a p-value is or a standard deviation. So
at physio school,
you learn it. It's pretty dry stuff. It's kind of conceptually difficult. You learn it enough to pass the assessment, and then it goes into the ether because you don't use it. But most of us hang on to that idea that we were taught, and is still taught to some extent, that if your p-value at the end, say we're comparing a difference between two groups after a treatment, and one of the outputs of our statistical analysis is a p-value, and if our p-value crosses some magical threshold, which we've nearly all set at 0.05, then we've got a difference and our treatment is effective. And if our p-value doesn't scrape that completely arbitrary threshold of 0.05, then our treatment has failed and it is ineffective. Now, there's clearly a problem with setting any arbitrary threshold for effectiveness, that it can't really be a reasonable thing to do. But the bigger problem, I think, is this over-interpretation of what P tells us. At the best, the p-value gives us some sense of the probability of finding an effect of the size that we're observing or larger simply through chance alone. So it gives us a steer on whether any difference we're observing is real or not, or we should trust that it actually exists and hasn't just arisen as a function of chance. But actually, statisticians are pretty unhappy with its ability to do that. And if anyone's a bit nerdy and interested in investigating that further, David Colquhoun's written some fabulous stuff that's available online on some of the problems with p-values. But the bigger problem is it isn't a marker of clinical effectiveness. It's just a marker of whether there is a difference to be observed between the two groups. It doesn't tell us whether that difference is likely to mean anything to patients. So we come back to this problem of how big an effect do we need in order for us to assume or conclude rather that our treatment is effective. And so my view is that really, if you're a consumer of research, don't look straight to the p-value. Look at the data. What is the difference on average between the two groups? How much would you understand that difference would be likely to mean to patients? And all that means as a clinician is that you have to have a decent sense of what the outcome measures were that the study was using. And then you have to have a decent sense of what you think a clinically important difference would look like. Or maybe you might look to some consensus document for some guidance on what a clinically important difference would look like. And looking at that effect size and the confidence intervals around that, which are essentially a marker of the precision of that estimate, is a better steer than the p-value. I mean, there's a worry that you might be the case that if your p-value is slightly higher than 0.05, you might unfairly dismiss a treatment. And obviously, technically that's true. I think probably the problem in the therapies works the other way, that we'll often accept a treatment based on a p-value of less than 0.05 that really isn't delivering bang for the buck.
No, that's interesting. And I mean, we talk about, obviously, you say p-values and confidence intervals and effectiveness of a treatment, and very much statistical terms. Do you think that then you compare that to the clinical world and human beings and patient and human interaction? Do you think that, I mean, it's an understatement to say it's a challenge to fit that statistical world into real life, but do you think that we as clinicians kind of struggle to merge that? Do you think we're thinking, stats, without maybe going into the research and looking at, as you say, what difference would that actually make to a patient?
I mean that's there's lots of prongs to that. I think the first side of it is, I think probably for those engaged in social media and the Twitter community, there's so much talk about research, and we assume that engagement at some level with research is normal. And actually, I think there is a bigger problem across the profession, that there are substantial pockets of the profession who perhaps don't look at research at all. And, what I'm not saying is research is the be-all and end-all, but I think it's an important thing that we need to be engaging with, particularly because, we have professions that are, your qualification is a science degree, it's a BSc or it's an MSc. So we're making a claim there, aren't we? That to some extent, our professions are underpinned by science, and science is a process of robustly testing the assumptions and theories that we have about the world, and so I think it's really important, one, that therapists try and be scientifically literate, and two, that we engage with research. So there's the first thing is how much a therapist willing and able to engage with evidence. The literacy side of things is also important. I come at this as someone who spent years in the clinic and will make a confession of having a very low level of scientific literacy. I couldn't have picked up a clinical trial or a systematic review about effectiveness prior to moving into academia and really made sense of it. I genuinely couldn't have done so, partly because maybe my undergraduate training, partly because of laziness, partly because I had no cause to, actually. There was no driver for me to do it. And, when I came into clinical teaching, I wasn't a researcher, but my job kind of required that I move into that and do a PhD. And that process of doing a PhD for me was the one that gave me at least some of these skills, some of the skills that I need to do it. But we can't assume that those skills are out there unless we make efforts to try and get them out there. There's loads of positive stuff going on at some scale, the clinical academic pathways, lots of MSCs out there, lots of physios engaging in postgraduate education. I've got a bit of an interest to declare because I've run a few courses trying to do a 2-day workshop on how you best read a paper and critically appraise evidence. So I guess I'm a bit compromised by making this point, but I really think it's important that we all try and do that. And actually, I think you could get a bit more benefit doing that maybe than learning the next new hot technique in your field, because it would give you the skills to ask better questions about the next hot technique and to be able to appraise the answers to those questions, if indeed there are any, So there's that issue of clinical literacy. And then there's the issue of how much does a between group difference from a clinical trial that was done in a very specific context really mean for the patient in front of you? And I get that people find it hard to transfer one to the other, but I think it's important not to overcomplicate what a clinical trial is. It is simply taking a claim that we make about the treatments that we do and subjecting it to a fair test. So we might be asking the question, if we take this package of care that we've designed, does it improve outcomes on average in these people that we think it's appropriate for, more than not doing it, or more than doing something else, or more than sending them back to the waiting list, or more than pretending to do it? And that's all we're doing with a clinical trial. Now, my view on that is that that's the only way to robustly answer the question, is to look across groups and on average. But I totally get the drive and the call to try and bring that back to the individual in front of you. And I get how trying to make decisions about the person in front of you can sometimes make those estimates a little bit abstract. But the reason clinical trials exist is because actually it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to make those decisions from the observations in front of you for any number of reasons. And that's why we look to a more robust, if possibly slightly more artificial approach to try and estimate how good our treatments are. I mean, if you think about trying to make that decision with the patient in front of you, there are so many layers of complexity that you're trying to manage. There's a slide that I use in my talk at Pain Cloud where you say, well, think about you're there with the patient who's just turned up in the clinic and you've done your assessment. You've got the person themselves. They're an individual with a complex narrative and a complex life and all sorts of things going on. And there's lots of things that will impact on what they say, what they do, and how they present. Then you've got their condition and what's driving their condition and their symptoms and their natural history and lots of variables around that, including their prior management and their beliefs around those things. And then you've got their lifestyle and you know, how they're positioned socially and what their family support is like and how they are economically and what other stresses they've got going on. And then you've got the intervention itself, which is often quite complex and might be tailored and possibly multimodal and might be delivered in a slightly nuanced way from person to person. And then finally, you've got you as a therapist. And what are you feeling like on that day? And you know, what's your ability to deliver this treatment? All of these things are at play all the time. And each one of them, you know, to paraphrase Shrek, it's an onion, isn't it? With multiple layers of complexity. So I get the idea that trials seem a bit abstract, but there are, in some respects, they are a correction to this problem of trying to divine the truth through all those multiple layers of complexity. And there is an argument to be said that that can only be done robustly by taking groups of people and controlling for certain things. And that's what we're doing in a clinical trial. So I do understand how trials can seem a bit abstract, but I think it's important when you run away from trials and you embrace that complexity of the clinical encounter, that you don't lose sight of how the complexity of the clinical encounter actually makes your job nigh on impossible in terms of determining the truth of effectiveness in the clinic. Does that make sense, or have I just...
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I was going to ask, as a researcher, does it ever feel like an impossible task?
I don't know. I guess I'm reasonably nihilistic about it. I'm interested in the process. And I'm not an idealist. Well, maybe I'm a frustrated idealist, but I'm fully aware that evidence doesn't always change practice. I'm actually quite aware that sometimes evidence shouldn't as well, and that process is itself complicated and nuanced. I think things are improving. I think there are conversations going on now that simply weren't happening at all when I graduated in 19 something, and so it's all positive, but we're in the midst of a cultural change, and it's difficult, I think, and it's slow, and it won't ever be perfect. But I think there's a recognition from professional bodies. I think there's a recognition from commissioners, and I think there's a recognition from loads of leaders in the profession that this stuff's important. We're just wrestling with what's the best way of doing it, and that consensus will come slow and hard, I think.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to kind of the future of research. But as you say, things are changing, and not only in the research, but I suppose in the mindset of physios, and we have the biopsychosocial aspects and things like that. Research now is going to be a lot different from 10 years ago. The types of things we're researching. Yeah. Do you see that play out? Do we kind of go, oh, we had all that research, and now we've got to shift and maybe look at the bigger picture? Do you see research doing that?
No, but I don't think research... I think in terms of what a trial is, it is what it is. That's the basic design. I think where things are changing is how we operationalize interventions. And, there's a bit of money available for physio research now. So rather than it be more about enthusiastic amateurs deciding to do a small test and publish it in a local trade journal, we've now got, world-leading research groups around the world who really can deliver this stuff at the highest level of quality and will compete with any other aspect of the clinical industry. We've also got national funders in Australia, with the NIHR here, with the NIH in America, who are prepared to throw a bit of money at it. And, obviously it's never enough, right? But in a way that's never happened before. I look around and I see clinical leaders running trials units like the guys at Keele, like Sally Lamb's group at Oxford, like Chris Maher's group in Sydney, who are able to really develop interventions and deliver multi-center trials that give us much more definitive answers in the right way than we were able to do before, whether those answers are positive or negative. So I do see things changing, and I think largely to the positive. As a Cochrane reviewer, the idea that we're developing really good trials is a joy, because a lot of our time is spent trawling through really bad trials and then coming up with really lame, uncertain conclusions. One of the challenges actually for evidence synthesis in systematic reviews is, what do we do when we get excellent definitive new trials and they enter an existing data pool of pretty crappy small trials? And, you know, because if you lump them in with everything else in, say, a meta-analysis, you know, their truth may well get washed away by all the pollution of reasonably dodgy trials. So that's something that we're wrestling with at the moment. So I think in terms of embracing the complexity in the biopsychosocial model, we're seeing loads of quality trials emerging around that, and we're getting better answers all the time, and I think that's a really positive thing. But obviously there's still substantial uncertainty, but we've never been better positioned to get better answers.
Brilliant. And do you think, I think one of the bugbears sometimes of clinicians reading research papers is conclusion, further research needed in this in this topic. Do you see that happening? Do you see less of that happening as we get better at, as you say, the bigger, well-funded trials?
I mean, I could be a massive hypocrite because I'm pretty sure I've written those words. I mean, at Cochrane, in our Cochrane group, we've tried to change our conclusion sections. So we'll have a conclusion for policymakers, for users, for clinicians, etc. And we try and make more specific conclusions than that. So, you know, so often though the answer is that none of these trials were done in such a way as to give us a good answer. They're either you know, flawed or carry avoidable or unavoidable biases, or they're too small, and that is frustrating. So what we've tried to do is say, okay, what do we think a better definitive trial looks like, and give a clearer steer on the study that we think is needed in an attempt to sort of contribute to reducing research waste. But, you know, the truth is, you know, there is nothing stopping anyone from doing another bad study. And in our quest as systematic reviewers to get the totality of the evidence, we will include those studies, but we need to think very carefully about how we include them and how we use them, and whether they should make it into any kind of formal analysis, you know.
Yeah.
But does it get frustrating, the uncertainty? It does, but this is the process, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is the process, and I think sometimes as clinicians we don't recognize, you know, how difficult it is to mine through that uncertainty to a better truth. Often it will take more than one very good multi-center trial as well, and that process takes time, money, and investment. I think the other thing we need to remember though is sometimes more research is not required. If you've got a whole bunch of studies, albeit small and flawed, but they're all telling you the same answer, but it's not the answer you want to hear, it doesn't mean we keep doing trials until we get the answer that we want. And
sure.
You know, one thing I often see in reviews where I think maybe the authors have taken a misstep is they identify a bunch of trials all at reasonably high risk of bias. And so they're at risk of bias, and that bias is of finding a bigger effect than is actually true, or an effect where there isn't an effect. That's why it's bias and not error, because it works, you know, in a specific direction. So they find a bunch of studies. They may end up with a p-value that is lower than 0.05, but very, very small effects, which to all intents and purposes are very likely to be actually exaggerated from what's actually true. And they conclude that there is promise and more research is required. Well, the other argument is, well, you've got a bunch of very small studies that have still failed to find a clinically important estimate of effect. Despite all these biases, maybe there isn't much promise there. I mean, actually, in the world of therapies and therapy science, if there's one word or one expression that is overused more than any other, it's promising evidence.
No, it lends strength to the argument that we need to get better at looking at research and critiquing research and improving our skills in that direction.
And also, I just think recognizing our cultural biases, you know, that there's a great line from Sir Peter Medawar about how exaggerated claims for any treatment aren't often the attempt of anyone to actually deceive. He calls it a conspiracy of goodwill, because everyone wants the same outcome. So, you know, if therapists and researchers all want to find a positive result, and funders really want that result to be positive, and, you know, if it is positive, you're more likely to get more funding. and patients want that result to be positive, you end up with this groupthink where we selectively attend to promise and maybe selectively inattend to some of those warning signs that maybe there's not something in this. Yeah. And I think that's just inherent in the human condition, really, that we want a positive result. And I think one of the things that, I've been called a naysayer before now. I kind of get that it would appear that way. I've got no personal investment in finding that treatments don't work, though. I think that's kind of disappointing. But I think one of the things that we could all get better at, and this isn't about physio, this is medicine generally, is we need to value negative results. We need to value null findings where there isn't a difference, because these are just as important as positive results, because they can steer us away from something that isn't useful. Everything that we do with a patient is an opportunity cost. When you're doing that, you could be doing something else. So if we can show that thing isn't really adding the value, it frees up time for something else. I often hear people saying, I haven't got time to do X, Y, and Z. Well, maybe you would have if you didn't do A, B, and C.
Yeah, fair enough. Speaking of bias, which we've kind of just touched on there, one of the most useful things I found about your pain cloud slides were talking about things like publication bias, citation bias, spin and things like that. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing a few tips for us as readers of the literature.
Yeah, so publication bias is this phenomenon by which it's easier for a positive study, and that's a study that concludes that there is a statistically significant or clinically relevant difference between a treatment and its comparison. It's easier for those to make it into print. For some reason, negative studies have a harder time making it into print, and that's called publication bias. And what it creates is this problem where the research that actually becomes available to us as consumers is biased towards the positive. So why might that happen? Well, I think small studies are easier to hide, so it's smaller studies where it happens more frequently. First, the researchers may have gone into it really wanted to show that treatment worked, and when it didn't, that paper ends up in the file drawer rather than being submitted to a journal or in the bin, because it didn't give us the answer we wanted. Another reason is because that paper's got to go out to peer review, so it's going to be reviewed by the community that are interested in that answer. And, often people in that community are quite invested in a positive answer themselves. So they might selectively give that negative paper a much harder time methodologically at the peer review process than it would have got if it was glowingly positive with the same methodology. And there's some reasonably good exploratory research that suggests that, negative studies get a harder time. And then there's the editorial desk. An editor might be less excited about filling his journal with negative findings because they tend not to make the press and they tend not to get citations. So they don't beef up the esteem factors associated with that journal. So there's lots of different things that are competing against negative studies finding their way into print. And the problem with that is then, let's say as a systematic reviewer, I want to get the answer whether this treatment works. But that answer has been really selectively skewed towards the positive by the fact that all these negative studies never made it to print. I'm going to get the wrong answer. So that's publication bias. That's one tension. But there are other tensions as well. I think because if you go back to that conspiracy of goodwill, researchers would rather have a positive result on the whole than a negative one because they're human too. So when they get a negative result or a result that isn't positive in the way that they'd hoped, they have a tendency to spin. And spinning means, well, maybe your result wasn't statistically significant, but you spin a positive out of it. You say, but it probably worked because, or it might be that, well, you didn't find a difference on your primary outcome, so you don't talk much about that. You talk about that secondary outcome where you did find a difference. That's called outcome switching, and it's another form of spin. Or maybe the planned analysis didn't give you the result you want, so you'll just run enough analysis until one of them does give you the result that you want. But there's lots of different ways to identify spin. If anyone's interested in it, I recommend them reading any paper by Isabelle Boutron, because she's really led the way in identifying spin. And we know it's there, right? We've got some really good systematic reviews that show that spin is there, particularly in negative trial reports. So if you've got a trial that was negative on its primary analysis, it is much more likely to have spin somewhere in the paper or the abstract. So not only do you have this issue of negative studies not making it to print, you have this issue of negative studies making it into print but being spun as if they weren't negative. And then there are other issues like, well, we've already talked on outcome switching as well. There is a really good paper that I showed in the Pain Cloud talk on the data from antidepressants. And it showed that if you looked at all these registered trials of the effectiveness of antidepressants, you ended up with about a 50-50 split if you took it from the trials registry of effective versus ineffective treatments. But once you removed all the ones that never made it into print, well, it looked more like a 70-30 split, positive to negative. And then once you then looked at those that made it into print, which ones had spin, well, some of those negatives turn into positives that way. And so there's like this systematic additive effect of different biases that take a reasonably equivocal research base and make it look really positive at face value. And that's a problem for us, and it's something that people should be aware of. You know, I do a little honesty test with my students, and all students actually, and that is I ask them, what part of a paper do you generally read when you read a paper? What about you, Felicity? What part of a paper do you read routinely?
Routinely, I would be guilty of skipping to the end of the conclusion.
Yeah, all of it, or just the last sentence?
The last bit, and then I'd probably go back and read the discussion as well. But I'm guilty of skipping over the results section, like numbers, maths.
Yeah,
give me the details.
It's totally normal. I think most people will put their hand up if I say, "Do you read the abstract?" And then half of them put their hands down if I say, "Well, all of it, or just the conclusions?"
Yeah.
A lot of people read the introduction because it's kind of interesting. It sets the scene. It gives you a bit of context, although often quite selectively, actually, in order to justify the question that's being asked. A lot of people read the discussion, but when you dig a bit further, well, only the conclusion of the discussion. And if you dig a bit further, sometimes only the last couple of sentences. But the the sections that fewest people read are the methods and the results. And that's a problem. And it's completely understandable. But those are the two sections of a paper where if there is a truth to be found, it's most likely to be found in those two sections. But people don't, because of fear of their own literacy around the subject, fear of jargon, fear of numbers. I think it's very common in physio. But, these are the two sections that people don't read. Now, the problem is, if you go back to that publication bias and spin and all these other biases, if you're only reading the abstract, you are literally reading only the bit that the researcher wants you to take home. But that is assuming that researcher is taking a genuinely balanced view over their data. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is there's quite a bit of evidence out there that that's not a reasonable assumption to make a lot of the time.
And I mean, as a confessed table skipper, am I missing a graph skipper? Am I at risk of missing things like, as you mentioned at Pain Cloud, axis cropping and things like that? So things we really could miss by skipping those bits.
I mean, it's always worth looking at graphs because, I mean, I always think a critical appraisal it's a bit of fun. It's a detective job. You can hunt around to see if something's good, but also there's a bit of pleasure in trying to catch errors and mistakes or just bad practice. Axis cropping is this process why, let's say I've got a 0 to 10 pain scale and I find a statistically significant difference of about 1 point on that pain scale between my treatment and control group. It's going to look a bit small. But if I cut that y-axis down to maybe 2 or 3 points of that pain scale, it's going to look a lot bigger. And there's no reason to do that. It's not hard to fit 10-point pain scale onto a page. But it happens quite a lot. And it's simply, it is that crude. It's just there to make things look bigger. I mean, I think the other thing is where data are presented on outcome measures that you recognize, you don't need any statistical skill to look at the average score in the treatment group and the average score in the control group and just say, well, how big is that difference? And a lot of the process of critical appraisal doesn't require detailed statistical analysis. A lot of it is about understanding a bit about methods. Your clinical expertise when it comes to critical appraisal is still absolutely crucial, and just being able to look at a difference between two groups and say, well, how big does it look?
Yeah. And it sounds like a minefield as well. And these it almost sounds like these things are out to trip us up. But actually, do you think from a researcher's point of view, it's more that, as you say, we've all got these human biases within, we want our research to say, yeah, this was great and it had a huge effect. Do you think that's the underlying reason why there are these biases?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of scientific method as an attempt to try and cope with some of the problems of the human condition. But the fact that humans are still the operators of science, it's not really surprising that we take a lot of missteps and misturns.
Yeah.
In the end, I think you can boil it all down to the fact that for often the best reasons, we all have vested interests. We're powerfully vested in the answers to these questions. That's one of the reasons that we ask them. It gives us enormous personal and professional value to think that everything that we do has value, and so we don't come at it as neutral observers. There are no neutral observers. That's the great challenge, I think, for quantitative research, really.
No, definitely. And we'll move on to talking about the NICE guidelines. And I've prepared for this podcast by reading a paper of yours that I'll put in the Google Drive for the listeners.
I can only apologise.
Oh, no, it's good. So the 2016 paper that you wrote about how guidelines are compiled and the differences between the NICE guidelines in the UK to the American and the Canadian guidelines for low back pain. So we can put that in the Google Drive page. But I wondered if you can give us some insight into the process behind the NICE guidelines for low back pain that you were involved in.
Yeah, so what happened around 2015 is when NICE looked strategically at its guideline offer, it decided it was time to update the guidance that it had on low back pain and sciatica. So what then happens is that NICE recruit a chair for that guideline, an independent chair, and then they go about the process of recruiting a guideline development group. And the requirements of a guideline development group is that they reflect all the disciplines involved in those patients, and they reflect patients with that condition. So they go about a recruitment process and advertise and interview, and I applied and was lucky enough, I guess, to be selected to that group. At the same time, what they do is they produce a potential scope for the guideline. What are the key questions that guideline is going to answer? And then they engage with all their stakeholders to have a consultation on that approach. So NICE will always, when they're about to write a guideline, they will put a call out for interested stakeholders to register their interest and become registered stakeholders. And at that point, they are invited to consult on the scope at first. The scope is then revised in response to that stakeholder engagement process, and then the job starts. So from the scope, they develop a bunch of systematic review questions, and in the NICE process for the back pain guidelines, rather than use existing systematic reviews, the NICE team produced de novo systematic reviews for each question. Those systematic reviews are then taken to the guideline development group, and over 2 to 2.5 years, we had sort of monthly meetings where we would go through the evidence and discuss it robustly, and then try and go from, and this is the hard part, going from the evidence to recommendations. And that will be, it's not a hierarchical process, so there will be consultant surgeons and rheumatologists and GPs and nurses and a physio and an osteopath and patients in that room, and everyone has an equal voice in that room. And I will say everyone really does, or did in our guideline, have that equal voice. And then you discuss and you debate and you think about the context in which we're trying to make clinical recommendations, and you produce those recommendations. If you think about trying to decide as a clinician, well, what does the evidence support for back pain? It's probably worth me just outlining the scale of the job. Ian Bernstein, who was one of the GPs on the guidelines, summarized that in the end we had 23 unique review questions. So we produced 22 unique systematic reviews. Now, the guideline group doesn't reproduce those. The technical systematic review team in the National Clinical Guideline Centre produced those. That involved the screening of 43,000 records from searches and the reviewing of 734 papers. After we produced the guideline, we had 720 stakeholder comments, 297 comments from the internal review process. It took us 3 years to produce the guideline, which, and I'm sure you've all read it page for page, runs to 3,600 pages. And we produced 41 clinical recommendations and 7 research recommendations. 7 because that's the format. We were asked to prioritize 7 key questions. But of course, there are many more than 7 that could be asked. And the reason I tell you that isn't to say, well, look how great it was, but just to give you an idea of the scale of the evidence out there and how hard it would be for any individual clinician to really make informed decisions on on an evidence base of that scale.
Absolutely.
So that was the process. And then once we produce our guidance, it goes out again for stakeholder review. We come back and revise and respond to those, and then eventually it gets published. Just in terms of the sort of recommendations that we can make, in the NICE process, you look at the evidence and the quality and the uncertainty around that evidence, and we use the grade system to try and quantify that. But then the options available to us as a group are that we might make no recommendation, and no recommendation really means, well, there's no evidence to guide us here, or really there's nothing strong enough to guide us. But yeah, it's very difficult to produce a guideline that says nothing,
Yeah.
So the next one is you got a do not offer. So do not offer is a very strong recommendation. Of course, these are the ones that are often politically controversial. And when we say do not offer, we're saying there is enough evidence for us to conclude in the end that this is not something that's delivering benefit. And so we would recommend not offering. And then, there's a more nuanced version, which is do not routinely offer. The danger with such a recommendation is it can be abused, because you can always say, well, that patient wasn't routine, and then carry on regardless with your non-recommended treatment that may well be ineffective because, on the argument that, that patient wasn't routine. Then you've got a consider. Now, you might consider offering this treatment, and a consider is where you've got some evidence of benefit and a favorable benefit-risk ratio, but maybe there are problems with that evidence, or there is still some uncertainty. And then you've got offer, which is where we're very convinced that this treatment is effective and cost-effective, and you really ought to be offering people this. And so you've got this sort of pyramid of potential options, and you've got to try and navigate on the strength of the evidence which of those you go with. And I think it's quite telling with regards low back pain, and the evidence around low back pain is that generally the strongest recommendation we could make was a consider rather than an offer, because actually, when you do look at the evidence for treatments for low back pain across the board, I think it's quite humbling what we see in those results. And of course we seem to have some treatments that offer some benefit, but we're not where we need to be. Or where we'd like to be, I think, and I think we should all sort of take a moment to reflect on that, because it's a driver for change and improvement, if nothing else.
Absolutely. No, and do you think it's ever okay to ignore the guidelines? Because do you think a clinician could have a reason around that if there was a non-specific low back pain, someone who fit the bill of the guidelines? Is it ever okay to ignore them?
What do you think?
Personally, I want to say no. I want to say no. The guidelines, great. But as you say, what a lot of people will argue is, but some of this research. I don't want to argue with the person who helped write the guidelines based on the arguments of some people whose argument that I don't fully know either.
No, I asked you though. You're not arguing with me.
Yeah, no. But some people will say, oh yeah, but the evidence wasn't great, for instance, or. But I've used acupuncture and it helps a lot. I think that's probably the most common one I've heard. And I don't use acupuncture myself. I'm not qualified, but that's what I've heard back from colleagues.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, if we were going on to the argument, I've seen it work in practice, then ultimately I don't feel particularly that argument has too many legs. Although of course it's still a common one, for all the reasons that we've discussed earlier, and well-established reasons about the difficulty in divining clinical effectiveness through observation in the clinic. If we took that rule, then essentially we'd still be doing bloodletting and pretty much every other treatment that's been used in history. I don't want to single out any individual intervention here. What I would say is, one of the things that we should do when we're thinking about whether we should follow guidelines is reflect on how we ever got into a position where we routinely use and offer treatments that haven't been shown to be effective and safe. That's the first thing, is that, of course, all these treatments exist for back pain. And yet we have this remarkable situation where many of them can't be shown to work, or there just isn't the evidence base. And it suggests that, to some extent, that we've got the cart before the horse. We roll things out before we've adequately tested them. So that's something that I would ask people to think about. Is it ever all right? I mean, a guideline is a guideline. It's not a rule. I think with any guideline that is used to inform policy, we have to recognize that policy itself needs to be interpreted in local contexts, and that to routinely roll out any policy blindly can lead to errors. And there are lots of examples of that in medicine. Actually, I had a really interesting experience recently where I was speaking to a military group, and I had a room full of soldiers to talk to, and the screen was broken, so we had to bring in a telly. And I said, can we roll it to the middle so that everyone can see it? And they said, no. I said, well, have you got an extension lead? And they said, well, no, we can't use an extension lead. I said, why not? They said, health and safety. And I thought, but they're soldiers. So I'm just thinking about, I use that as a kind of flippant example of how, know, if we use policy blindly, we can make some really weird decisions.
Yeah.
I think the problem, though, is we really need to ask ourselves, well, what is our good reason for not following the guideline? Actually, there's quite a lot of evidence of why people don't follow guidelines. One paper broke it down into don't know, don't want, and don't do. So they don't know that the guideline exists, or they haven't really read it. They don't want to change their routine. They feel that the guideline is a threat to their professional autonomy. They've got no confidence in the developing organisation. Or they don't do it because maybe it's not acceptable to patients, or they've got a lack of time or skills. And there are lots of reasons why it might be hard to follow a guideline. A review by Fisher found that, you can break it down into personal factors, which are things like, problems managing the sheer volume of guidance out there, a lack of knowledge about how to interpret a guideline, a broad rejection of the evidence-based practice paradigm. There's a really interesting qualitative paper on osteopaths and back pain guidelines called Quiet Dissent that is worth looking at by a researcher called Fig Latham. And in the end, when they sort of tried to pull together what they'd heard, they decided that when certain groups of osteopaths were thinking about guidelines, they did it through the prism of a flipped evidence hierarchy, where at the top of the hierarchy was personal opinion and anecdotal evidence and the sort of philosophical underpinnings of their treatment systems. And at the bottom was evidence from trials and systematic reviews. Then there were guideline factors. What if a guideline's wrong or badly written, or makes recommendations that for some reason aren't credible or feasible in the context that you're working? And then there are kind of external factors like, well, what if you don't have that buy-in from local policymakers and commissioners, or what if you don't have that buy-in from your multidisciplinary team? Everyone in healthcare thinks that what they're doing is right. It's a bit like, I look at our current political situation, and the funny thing about it is no one thinks they're the baddie.
Yeah.
Right? So whatever side you're on in a very polarized debate, everyone thinks they're the goodie. And I think it's the same in the clinical field, that other people might have to do evidence-based practice, but I know what I'm doing works, so it doesn't really apply to me. And I think it's important to think about that. If we found that spinal injections aren't offering clinical benefit, but your local pain intervention team insisted on keep doing them, how would you feel about that? Would you feel they were being unprofessional? Do you think they should follow the guidelines, or do you think they're allowed to continue to do injections in the face of the evidence, because in the end they know that it works? If you think that's wrong, but you think it's okay for you to ignore the guidelines, I think we need to reflect on why that might be. But I still think in the end, any implementation of a guideline needs to be done with a nuanced respect for the context in which it's being implemented. But that shouldn't be used as an excuse for not implementing it.
Absolutely. Do you ever think that guidelines like the NICE guidelines, where we know there's been a reliable process, followed a systematic process, do you ever think our bodies, let's say for example the HCPC, should enforce these things? Do you ever think there should be some enforcement that would maybe eliminate the not? Sorry, I just haven't read them, because you'd have to, or the policymakers that might influence them as well.
I don't know how that would work. I mean, I don't know how you would audit compliance, and I don't really like it, because I think that we're much better striving for adoption rather than imposition of these things. Because if you can bring people with you, they'll be happier in their work and they'll do a better job. I think if there's a better lever than professional bodies, I think it's probably funding bodies that ultimately, from a very cynical perspective, policymakers decide which interventions will be reimbursed and paid for. And so that is probably a more powerful lever than the professional bodies. What I would say, though, is I think professional bodies could take a stronger leadership role in trying to promote evidence-based practice. And I think I do see that the CSP, for instance, are engaging with that. And but I think we probably have a way to go with it. I think it's very hard for a professional body to act as a representative of the interests and beliefs of all of its members and act as an advocate for evidence-based practice. And in the end, there's something we wrote in one of those back pain guideline review papers the other year was, we often conflate what's good for our profession with what's good for patients. And, I would hope that often the two things align, but it is an assumption to assume that they always do. And my view is that we should always probably, and it sounds a bit pompous, but we should be thinking about what's best for patients regardless of what it means for the profession.
Yeah.
Sometimes I hear arguments about evidence and evidence-based practice, and sometimes I see truth in them, and sometimes I see what I would call a defense of the faith in them. And I think I can understand where that comes from, but ultimately, we need to test what we do well, so that we can make sure that our offer to patients is what we sell it to be.
Yeah, that was really valid points there, really interesting. One little last bit about the NICE guidelines. Now, you may not be able to answer it, but it was just why did we add sciatica to the kind of non-specific low back pain mix? I don't know if you'd know, or whether you got to the process after they'd established that it was going to be low back pain and sciatica.
I did actually come in after the scope had been established, but actually I think it makes a lot of sense to combine the two. I think the two go hand in hand in the clinic. I think it would have been more artificial to exclude it and produce a separate guideline. The only thing that we didn't cover in terms of sciatica, and there's sciatica, defining that is itself a bit of a difficult issue. Yeah. And I think we tried to manage it in as pragmatic way as possible. The only evidence that we didn't specifically look at was the evidence on neuropathic pain meds, because there was an existing 2013 guideline on neuropathic pain meds, which was taken to basically be relevant to sciatica. Right. So we used that instead of re-reviewing that evidence. But I think, why wouldn't you include sciatica? I think there's a stronger argument for including sciatica, however you define it, in a guideline for back pain than there is sort of artificially separating it out. And on the whole, when I look at the guideline, I think we've done a reasonably good pragmatic job. But of course, again, I've got a powerful vested interest, haven't I? Because I was part of the process.
Fair enough. No, I think that's brilliant. And so going on to, I think as physios, we love one of the big things that comes up when we talk about evidence-based practice. We do love talking about evidence-based practice as physios, but using empirical data to guide the treatment of individual humans is not without its critics either. No. And some will point to the biases that you've already mentioned, or that the volume of evidence is just too great now, or too broad, or too focused on low-value modalities, or that all the evidence can do now is highlight potential marginal gains, that all the good stuff's been taken and done. Or that structural guidelines don't necessarily translate into the human being in front of us, and that a lot of the studies exclude those with comorbidities, which again isn't like real life. They're kind of huge issues that people bring up. And I wondered what your thoughts are on that. I realise that's a lot of stuff to throw at you, but what would be your response to some of those lines of thinking?
So, there's been a lively discussion around evidence-based practice. And I recognise a lot of the challenges. I look back to Trish Greenhill's paper in 2014 about the crisis in evidence-based practice. And I do recognise the challenges presented by the sort of complexity of the individual patient in their context. In fact, we've touched on that earlier. And one of my views is, I get it, but in the end, we don't solve the limitations of RCTs by reverting to the problems that they were designed to fix, if that makes sense. That trying to divine the truth in the complexity of the everyday with the patient in front of you is very difficult too. So, the point is that, and we all do this as clinicians. We build our narrative of reasoning, and then we try and put all these variables together, and we come up with a plan, and that's all we can do. But, when we're trying to navigate the uncertain narratives of those patients in front of us, there are endless potential hurdles and wrong turns. And it's very easy for us to fit convenient but incorrect narratives to that picture. And we may never be shown our error because of, outcomes lots of things influence what outcomes occur with a patient. Trials don't replace clinical skills. And if you look at the original models of evidence-based practice, they were never supposed to, but they can point out that if you deliver this treatment in the way it's designed to, in the people that it was designed for, in a robust way and compare it to some reasonable alternative, and you're really not seeing much difference, if that doesn't make you question what you do with the individual patient in front of you, well, I think you're selectively inattending to a very useful source of information. When I look at the sort of the campaign for real evidence-based medicine, I recognise a lot of that stuff. The biases and corruption of the evidence infrastructure is definitely a thing. The unintended consequences of bad evidence-based policy, which we've touched on about, how policy should be interpreted to some extent flexibly, but we still got to trust ourselves to be making decisions for the right reasons. The difficulty of taking averages in populations to individuals. The problems of representation in the evidence, that actually, our evidence base often relates to people with single conditions from white middle class backgrounds. Women are systematically underrepresented. BME groups are systematically underrepresented. Different gender groups are, systematically underrepresented. Socioeconomically, those groups are systematically underrepresented. We've got big challenges, but that in itself doesn't undermine the idea of it. It just means we've got to get better at doing it, evidence-based medicine. I think all of these things, this crisis and this campaign, is a really positive thing if it drives a better design of trials and reviews that better consider context and complexity, and then we go from those trials and reviews and consider more carefully how we implement those results in practice. And implementation science is a really interesting emerging field that is worth following, and I'm not an expert in that. I think what worries me, and the negative side of it, is people love to bash evidence-based medicine and evidence-based practice and idea as a knee-jerk reaction against the fact that maybe so far evidence-based practice hasn't been awfully kind to them, and hasn't given them the answers that they want. And I think there is a phenomena, well, this is personal opinion, of course, but there is a phenomena of many people jumping onto the critique of evidence-based medicine as a way of denying it as an idea, because in the sense that in the end it threatens them, it feels like you can use that as a way of taking power back. But I think that's problematic in a way, because it isn't about taking power away. None of this should really be about power. It should be about just getting better information.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think it's more about getting better at the trials and gaining that empirical data, rather than changing our whole mindset about evidence-based practice. You're feeling it's a good foundation by the sounds of it.
I'm all for recognising the limitations of trials and systematic reviews, but I don't want to do that at the expense of recognising the limitations of observation in the clinic and clinical expertise. The two work best if they work hand in hand, and we're humble enough to accept that we could be wrong about stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, what can we do to get better at that? But I think that may sum it up, accepting that we are human as well, and we feel it's a skill, which it is, to accept a patient with all of their prior beliefs and things like that, and things that make them. But we all have that as well. We as clinicians have that, whether we're practicing or just reading a paper or researching. And it sounds like that might be where we have to look inwards a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think we are getting. I think we're getting better at research, as we said right near the start, and I think that's an ongoing process. I think it would be great if more people engage with research at a deeper level. I would love for the average Twitter conversation. Well, the first thing is I would love more people who don't currently engage with research to engage. Yeah. Twitter is a way of doing that, but I've actually disengaged with Twitter because it feels a bit like a poisoned well most days. And I think everyone could stand to have a look at how they behave on social media and think about that. But I think when we then look at how evidence is being used, and the forum that will see it being discussed most is Twitter or Facebook, I would love to see the maturity of that conversation go up a little bit. I would love to see people approaching questions from a position of more equipoise, that actually they're prepared to have any answer to their question. And that's not what happens. It's all very tribal at the moment. That actually, people already know the answer, and evidence-based practice arguments become essentially people throwing PubMed links to papers that they've never read at each other that in some way are an evidence-based argument. I remember this fabulous example a couple of years ago where someone put in a link to a trial on dry needling for myofascial pain.
Right.
They said, look, it works. here's this abstract. And then the next line on the tweet was, now watch all the evidence-based nutters get their panties in a bunch about this. So I tweeted back and I said, I haven't read the paper, but I'd be happy to look at it. And we'll have a think about what it means and how good it is. And can you bounce me a link or send me a PDF? And he said, I can't access it myself. It's behind the paywall. And I was like, wow, what a phenomenal thing to do. Just take a step back and look at that.
Yeah.
Well, I've got this compelling evidence that I've never read that my treatment works. Now watch all these unreasonable people have the temerity to read it,
to question it,
and possibly critically appraise it. But that I think that kind of characterizes what's going on at the moment.
Yeah.
And my view is, right, that if you want to know what the evidence is for something, but you approach it by trying to find trials that tell you your treatment works or give you the answer you want, you're not doing evidence-based practice. You'll only accidentally do evidence-based practice if the evidence accidentally aligns with your view. So actually, when anyone picks up a paper, they should take a minute before they even read past the title and say, what do I want the truth to be? What are my biases? Am I prepared to hear any answer? And if you're really not, stick it in the bin. There's no point. Don't go forward. There's no point, And I think perhaps that's something that doesn't occur as often as it should. And if I could do anything, it would be trying to get people to not know the answer before they've read the paper, and then trying to get them to read the paper.
Yeah. And I like that. I think that's brilliant. Ask a question, but be prepared to hear any answer. I think that's a great takeaway message from that. That's brilliant. Well, Neil, thank you very much. That's been brilliant.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Fab, same goes. Have you got anywhere that you'd like to direct the listeners in terms of resources or your own stuff, the course that you mentioned?
Okay, so I'm not going to market a course, but if you ever, but there is one, and if anyone wants to do it, we can talk. But that's all I'll say about that. I think we wrote a paper that summarises quite a lot of the issues in physical therapy in 2015, called "Interpreting Effectiveness Evidence in Pain: A Short Tour of Contemporary Issues." That's a good place to start. There was a fabulous paper, and I can't remember the journal, but if you Google "Key Concepts for Informed Health Choices" by Ian Chalmers, that's a brilliant outline paper. There's a lovely book on the fundamentals, which is really written for a lay audience, and it's completely free and online, called Testing Treatments, which is all about that process and how you might pick through various health claims. They're all good. Now, the other thing is, if you're worried about trying to pick up a paper and make sense of it, there are just a fabulous set of tools available from an Oxford group called the CASP tools. Some of you might be familiar with it. CASP stands for Critical Appraisal Skills Programme. CASP-UK is the website, I think .org.uk. But on there they have these help sheets that basically help you for any design, systematic review, observational studies, qualitative studies, clinical trials. They just give you a few questions to ask, and they give you a few pointers about how to ask them and what to look for in terms of how to tell, number one, is this study reliable and reasonable? And number two, is it really a study that informs decisions about the people that I care about making decisions about? So CAST tools, I can't recommend them enough. We use them here in our master's teaching at Brunel. I guess the other thing I should say, because I can advertise for Brunel, is that we're developing a whole host of postgraduate master's pathways here at Brunel, and a lot of this critical appraisal stuff will be built into those, including MSK pathways, critical care, neuro rehab. So if people are interested, do look on our website. There you go. That's all the shameless marketing I'm going to do.
Brilliant. That's fab. If people did want to get in touch with you about what you mentioned at the beginning, is there anywhere where can they get you?
You can get me on Twitter. I'm a bit of a transient presence, and I might not have time to respond promptly to everything. Or you can find my email on the Brunel website.
Spot on. That's brilliant. Thanks again, Neil. That's been absolutely brilliant.
Not at all. Thanks, Felicity.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Pretty sure you'll agree. Felicity and Neil absolutely nailed that. Really informative podcast that has certainly opened my eyes to various different things and reacquainted me with some of the deep biases that can exist across research and how I interact with them, and my own biases that I bring to the party all the time. So it's often uncomfortable to be exposed to those things, but it was done so brilliantly and empathetically, which is really nice. So yeah, thank you so much to Neil for being on the show once again. Thank you, you lot, for all your feedback so far. I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say on this episode, so please do so on Twitter at TPM Podcast. Instagram, I think it's the same. Facebook, you'll find us as Physio Matters Podcast. And then, of course, follow hashtag the big R's for all things reform-based chatter. I'm back on the mic next time to cover motivational interviewing. We're taking a real hard look at motivational interviewing and its pros and cons, when to use it, when not to use it, and take a real close look, which I'm really looking forward to. So yeah, I'm afraid you've got me to deal with next time. In the meantime, do find us on Patreon if you'd like to throw us a few quid. PayPal as well. Options on the website at choosehealth.co.uk, which is a very pretty new website, you might notice as well when you get there, in support of our new headquarters in Timperley, South Manchester. If you got any patients to send our way, then send them via the website, and please do tell them you sent them, and we'll be in touch with all the variety of perks that we can bring you if you send us any referrals, of course. Conferences I mentioned at the top of the show, 18th and 19th of October in Manchester, the Big R's Conference, Reforming MSK Practice, is going to be an absolute barnstormer, and it's going to also coincide with the launch of our Manifesto for Reform, policies and proposals that you can get behind and hopefully sign and endorse along the way. So do pay attention to that, reform.physio/conference, and be keeping an eye out on all the materials that are going to come up and ticket options as they emerge. So lots to tell you, and thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. I'm glad to throw it back to a very reluctant Neil O'Connell for our cheesy sign out.
You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters.